Welcome to the second installment of Calen-deliria, which is the 13th installment of Radio K overall. I'm Adam Kadri. This episode is about the movie Boyhood. And to give you a sense of the timeline here, Boyhood was released in 2014. My guest for this episode, Katie Harrison, sent me an email on August 23rd of 2014 saying, "Please watch this movie and send thoughts." I replied to that email saying that I had indeed watched the movie on July 4th, 2018. We then recorded this podcast on July 13th, again, of 2018, and on August 9th of 2018, I uploaded the previous installment of Radio K, Ask Tell number 11, and said that I expected to have Calen-deliria number 2, which you are currently listening to, up in a few weeks. I figured that since it had already been recorded, all I needed was a few hours to do the edits, and that I could knock that out in my spare time. What I did not realize is that when you go into public education, you no longer have any spare time. And that was how a few weeks turned into 70. So, let's travel back in time to those halcyon days when I did more with my life than grade papers and write worksheets, and meet our guest.
I am Katie Harrison. I have been friends with Adam for, like 5 years now. We met because I left a comment on his blog after reading it for a decade, and then we subsequently emailed and met up, and it's been great. I am a union organizer turned union data person, and now I'm thinking about shifting into something that has more to do with people's brains, like being a therapist. So that is who I am.
So the reason I wanted to have you on is that even though I watched this when I did, because it was number 3 in the Scandies for 2014, you had recommended it to me months before the Scandi list even came out. And my memory is terrible these days, but I seem to recall that even before that, you'd left a comment on my Discus page asking whether I was going to review the Before Sunrise, Before Sunset series of movies by the same director, Richard Linklater. Am I remembering that right?
I think what actually happened is that I left a comment and said that I watched those movies in part because I had read your review of them and they sounded interesting. It took me like 5 years, so we're on a similar schedule of movie watching. So you influenced me to watch those movies, and that's why I was so interested to talk to you about this one when it came out.
Oh, how about that? For those who haven't seen them, Before Sunrise is about an American boy and a French girl in their early 20s who meet cute on a train in Vienna, and on a whim they decide to spend the night wandering around the city talking about life, the universe, and everything. Before Sunset was made 9 years later and is set 9 years later, as the two of them meet up again for the first time since that night at a book signing, and they talk for an hour, sort of skirting around the question of what that night had meant to them. So what did you think of those movies? I mean, I'm guessing you liked them.
The Before movies were my favorite movies for like almost a decade. Before Sunrise, I absolutely loved the first time I watched it. I found it completely transporting. I was 20 years old when I watched it, and I'd never really seen a movie where people talk to each other that way. Yeah, it was just very naturalistic, and I was in love with the characters and their romance. I was very compelled by it. And then I watched Before Sunset. I thought that was even better. I found it really compelling. Plus, it, sort of has a happy ending for their story. Then the third one hadn't come out yet, Before Midnight. I watched that eagerly at the Angelica Theater in New York when it came out. And, that was rough going. It was tough. I liked it a lot, but it was tough. Marriage is tough, So I haven't rewatched that one. I've been meaning to, but I haven't gotten around to it because it's not the same sort of transporting romance as if you put the first two together. But now that I'm in a long-term relationship again, I'm kind of interested to look back at that again. But yeah, I loved the time gap. I thought it was fascinating. Even though I watched the first two movies close together in time, it felt different than if they'd just put old age makeup on them. You could tell it was made in a different era. It looked different. I'm not sure what else to say about why I like them. It just seems so apparent. But I will say, I went back and looked at Before Sunrise again, because I then did my thing where I tried to get everyone I know to watch the movies with me. And so I've now watched them at least 3 or 4 times, the first two. And I just can't watch Before Sunrise again. It is unwatchable. These teenagers are the worst. And I think partly that's I've watched it too many times now, but it's also I'm a little bit older and like their ramblings about like the nature of life and the world and like just like their basic takes on love are just I'm just not that interested. And they're compelling characters, but I just can't listen to them blather anymore.
Yeah, I found that the before movies were kind of poisoned for me after I saw Linklater's movie Waking Life and realized that apparently he wanted us to appreciate the blather. But let's move on from the before movies to Boyhood, because here we have another iteration of the trick those movies use, which is that Before Sunrise is not quite real time, but it's 9 hours in 2 hours or something. So it's a lot closer than a lot of movies are. Close to real time. And then with the Before Sunrise, Before Sunset pair, you have, again, real time, but it's 9 years in 9 years. And then you throw Before Midnight into the mix, and suddenly it's 18 years in 18 years. So we have an evening in an evening, let's say. Then we have a decade in a decade. And then we get to Boyhood, which is a decade in an evening. That's the big gimmick. And that's a lot more outrageous. The idea of filming a movie over the course of 12 years and then putting it all together and showing it all in one chunk. That's the big thing that got all the press, was the Boyhood stunt. But yeah, it occurred to me that in terms of like, wow, aging in real time, it's never been done. It's always done with makeup. I thought, well, yes and no, in the sense that, yeah, with the Before series, we are seeing real aging. It's just that it's aging in real time. And we see even that is not all that uncommon in that TV does this all the time. Any sitcom family, you watch the kids grow up. So I guess my big starting point is the question of how is Boyhood different from growing up along with a sitcom family or growing up along with Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy in the Before movies?
The first thing I should say is that I have never watched a sitcom family grow up in real time. I did not grow up watching television. I did not grow up watching that many movies. So I'm trying to think of examples where I've actually really seen that unfold along with me in real time in the way of the Before movies. I can't really think of any that I experienced. And so the experience is, I guess, of me is watching TV in a binge format. So I watched 7 seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer in 6 months. So I kind of watched them age. But it's not that interesting because you don't really notice them aging. They look pretty much the same. You know, it's just not that. They're already in their 20s. It happened over 7 years. I didn't really see it. I didn't feel a change. I knew they were supposed to be growing up and they were doing different things, but they didn't seem like they were in high school in the first place. So it didn't really land in the same way, I guess.
Yeah, the binge watching thing did occur to me. And even in the olden days, thanks to syndication, I did watch the Brady Bunch grow up in a matter of weeks. But I guess that in diving right into talking about the big stunt of filming a single movie over the course of 12 years, I kind of skipped right over exactly what it was that Linklater was filming. So why don't you actually tell the folks at home what the movie is about?
Well, I'll start with the Netflix description that I don't quite agree with, which says, after divorcing, a mother and father continue to share the task of guiding their young son through youth and adolescence and finally to adulthood. The reason I don't agree with this is because the movie is not about the mother and father. The movie is about the boy, Mason, and what it's like for him to grow up and be a boy from age, I don't know, maybe 6 to 18. And the parents come into it. Parenting is, a big part of his life, and their individual journeys are not completely ignored. They're present, they have arcs, but it's about what it's like to be a kid in various parts of Texas in, kind of a migrating class status in the 2000s and what it's like to grow up. And I have to say, like, sort of tracing the continuities between 6 or 8-year-old Mason and 18-year-old Mason and what stays the same and what changes. That's what I think it's about.
Here's what I found interesting. The movie is called Boyhood, so I was expecting more of a focus on just Mason and less of a focus on his parents and even like his sister and, various other supporting characters. And one of the things that I was sort of braced for was the very fact that the name of the movie is Boyhood, which is an unusual word.
Yes.
Because
the movie was not called Childhood.
Exactly. Yeah, I never talk about my boyhood. I've never heard any guy talk about his boyhood. I've never heard any woman talk about her girlhood. At least in American English, the word is childhood. No matter what sex you are, it's childhood. You talk about what kind of childhood you had. So the fact that they were using specifically Boyhood made me think that this was going to be like some sort of meditation on masculinity or something. And then I found out that Boyhood was a name that they applied at the last minute, because the name of the movie was supposed to be 12 Years. But they had to change the name because right at the time they were going to release it, 12 Years a Slave won the Oscar.
Uh-huh.
So they needed to make sure that there wasn't any confusion, and so like the studio said, nope, you gotta change the name.
Yep.
And so they went with Boyhood. And knowing that the movie is supposed to be called 12 Years suddenly makes the focus on the other characters and about the family as a whole make a lot more sense. That yes, it's true that Mason is the focal character, but it's not supposed to be just about him. It's actually supposed to be about these 12 years. But I guess that saying all this sort of puts me on the side of that Netflix description more than maybe I want to be. So to return to the title the movie actually did end up receiving, to what extent did you think that this film actually was the meditation on boyhood that I was expecting it to be?
It struck me as quite a bit, actually. And I'm actually pleased that it was called Boyhood and not Childhood because, I don't love when, like, the universal experience is represented by a white man. Like, I just, like, that sucks, and I wish that we would do less of that. So I'm happy that at least it's called Boyhood. It did have quite a few scenes that were quite gendered, which is not surprising because that's, childhood is when you're kind of learning to gender. And Mason is learning to gender, and you see him doing it. Some of the things that jumped out at me were the scene where all those like high school kids are in the empty house with the college kids, all boys, and they're having this horrible conversation about like whether they've had sex and with who, and like whether they're lame and like breaking stuff. And I was just like, oh my God, like this is horrible. Like I'm so glad my childhood didn't feature any scenes like this. And then some of like Ethan Hawke's advice to Mason about how to deal with women, both when he's kind of younger and they're on a camping trip and he's like, I have a girlfriend, what should I do? We talk on the phone, but it doesn't go very well. I don't know. And then Ethan Hawke is kind of like giving him advice on how to talk to women. The advice he gives him is great. I found it to be like quite gender neutral advice, but there's definitely something about the unique relationship between a boy and his father there. And then later when Mason breaks up with his high school girlfriend, he's kind of mopey. And then Ethan Hawke is like, girls are always trying to trade up. Like stuff like that, like that's like a man-to-man convo. That's not a generic childhood convo. And I think it was kind of attentive to the ways that he was being formed, into a boy and then a man, as opposed to just like a child.
When you put it that way, I hadn't thought about this while watching the movie, but just listening to you talk, it occurs to me that the project of watching a kid grow up reminds me of the work of Jock Sturges.
Yes!
Yeah.
I thought of this, but I forgot to mention it. Yes.
For listeners who haven't heard of him, Jock Sturges is a photographer who's spent nearly 50 years now taking pictures of kids as they grow up. And, his project has been going on for so long that now a lot of them have their own kids. So in his later books, you see a whole lifetime unfold within just a few pages. The difference with Boyhood, of course, is that the work of Jock Sturges is oppositely gendered. The vast majority of it is about girls becoming women. But still, the whole idea of watching so much change unfold and yet retain so much continuity it brings me back to the question of what it was like for you to watch this movie and see 12 years of aging in 3 hours.
One of the things that I noticed was that Mason is really the same kid when he's 8 and when he's 18. He has the same basic personality. He's pretty quiet. He listens a lot to what's happening around him. He's kind of like artistic and like a little bit weird, but not so weird that he's like doesn't have friends and isn't cool. Yeah, there were some incidents in the movie. There's like the terrible alcoholic stepfather, number one, pretty terrible, but not as bad. Alcoholic stepdaughter, number two, I feel like were the main like disruptive incidents. He's like moving. His mom is changing a lot as she's going from being like kind of a stressed out single mother without a lot of resources to like a professor, or at least an adjunct. But there's no actual like break in this movie. There wasn't a real sense of like, this is the before, and then like precipitating incident, and then this is the after. I felt like it was a pretty even unspooling with a few major incidents along the way. Yeah, in terms of the actual gimmick of doing it, it just made it feel real. I just loved watching his face change and his mannerisms change, but also stay the same. Like I just found it completely hypnotic to do that. I haven't spent that much time around kids. Like, I'm still really startled when I see a 6-week-old and then I see them 6 months later and they're like crawling around. And I see them 6 months later and they're freaking talking to me. Like, are you kidding? I'm completely blown away by that experience in real life. So it's not shocking that I was also blown away by having it in a movie that I could actually watch in real time and like actually compare as it was happening. So I thought that element was wonderful and worked extremely well. I don't know if I have much interesting to say about how it affects the narrative structure or anything, but I'm interested in your thoughts.
Probably the number one thing that struck me about this is that the fact that there was no real narrative arc seemed to be making the case that life doesn't have a narrative arc. That if you're looking for, like, where's the precipitating incident that's going to show, like, here's where he comes of age, here's where childhood gives way to adulthood or something, that's something that you see in books and movies and things, but that's not how life works. I was really struck by the way that the narrative structure seems to highlight the ephemeral and episodic nature of life. Like with the two drunken stepfathers, we see the pattern repeating. We see that these guys just sort of come and go. On the one hand, it shows that she has a bad pattern that she's locked into, and it also shows how individually they're not really important. It just kind of goes to show the way that when you live your life in real time, whatever phase of life you're in feels really important. Like, this relationship that I'm in, this is one of the major stages of my life. And then it turns out like, it comes and goes in a year. And, when you watch it amidst 12 years, it's like, oh yeah, remember the year that she was married to that guy? That came and went really fast. And then I felt like, all right, so is this actually going to end up paying off? And I think that ultimately it pays off with Patricia Arquette's speech, which is that you think of life as consisting of these landmarks. When your kid goes off to school for the first time, when your kid goes on a first date, when your kid goes off to college and so forth. And at some point it's like, but wait a minute, what happens when you run out of landmarks?
Yeah, I really resonate with that. Yeah, I'm thinking about that. Yeah.
Well, you're giving that some thought. As long as you've brought up personal resonance, I have to admit that this movie made me think about the way that I've managed to put off a lot of life stages, maybe forever. The things that are traditionally thought of as the standard life stages and the things that my peers are now wrapping up. Getting married, buying a house, having kids. A lot of my old friends are now sending their kids off to college, and I'm still living basically the same life I was living in my 20s. And I've sort of been able to get away with it because people think I'm in my 20s. But the fact that I can see 50 on the horizon and yet nearly all of my current friends are in their 20s makes me wonder whether this is a condemnation of me. Like, am I just an eternal adolescent?
I don't know. I mean, I have a very different take on that, I guess, in terms of like value judgment or like whether that means you're an eternal adolescent. I think like I'm 30, I'm 29. I don't think I'm planning to have kids. This is the moment where a lot of people are starting to have kids, or at least are starting to sort of get worried about pairing up in time to have kids. It's starting to like really drive people's choices in a way that it wasn't really in my early 20s because of my educational and class background, I think. And yeah, I'm not planning to have kids. I'm pretty clear on that. I'm in a relationship with someone who's even more clear on that. And I don't know. I think I like hope to eventually get married or sort of steadily partnered, but I'm not planning to reproduce. And that's really what drives things, I think, in terms of these life stages, right? Like, there's job stuff, there's house stuff. Like, do you rent an apartment? Do you live with roommates? Are you buying a house? Like, all of that. Do you have nice stuff, or do you just have like secondhand IKEA, like, all of that stuff. But I do find myself wondering what I'm going to do with my 30s while everyone else is having kids. And just sort of thinking about that as I try to lock down my decision of like, yeah, no, I'm pretty sure I don't want to pursue reproduction as a thing I do.
Yeah, I just wanted to flag up the importance of the point that you just made about how all this is inflected by region and class. As you know, a few years back, I became close with someone from Appalachia, and out there, the life stages are all different. She got out as soon as she could, but her classmates and family members were pretty much all married and having kids before they were even out of their teens. Whereas those friends of mine that I mentioned who are sending their kids off to college soon, they mostly got married in their late 20s and had those kids in their early to mid 30s. And that's what I've blithely been calling traditional and standard.
Yeah, so we kind of had similar timelines. Yeah, and we both also went to elite universities and knew a lot of people who were quite ambitious and getting a lot of education and trying to get fancy jobs and kind of treating that as like the main through line of their life is like, let's get this career on lock and or let's figure out like my true calling type of stuff. I don't know. I don't want to speak for you, but that's what my Yale friends and my fancy like Boston public high school friends are kind of about for the most part. It's even different for my partner who grew up in Arkansas, and yeah, they all have kids. We're the same age. It's just that southernness and that smaller place and Christianity, all of that means that like their kids are all, 5 and 10 years old already. And they're married even if they're not having kids. So it's just interesting.
And then, of course, you have the pundits who make it generational and say, oh, those millennials, they are eternal adolescents, putting off life stages. And then in return, you have the people who reply, wait a minute, what you're talking about as being cultural is to a great extent economic.
Yes.
Like, the reason that people aren't buying houses is not that they have different cultural priorities, it's that who the hell can afford a house?
Yeah.
So the idea of the life stage where you start upgrading to nice stuff.
Yeah.
That is a life stage, but it's also very class inflected.
Oh, yeah.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Lots of grown-ups never really get to upgrade to nice stuff, to be clear, right? Like, yeah.
So, since we've gotten into generational territory, I wanted to turn to one of the questions I was most interested in hearing you answer, which is this. So, you look at the show Mad Men. You're going from 1960 to 1971. So that's 12 years inclusive. And a lot of the show is about how by the end of the series, everyone's living in a different world from the one they started in. And yeah, the 60s do get talked up as a time of particular upheaval, but even if Linklater had made this movie about my childhood, same years as Mason, age 6 through 18, you'd be starting with Funky Town and finishing with Smells Like Teen Spirit. So again, it feels like different worlds. Or at least it feels like that to me. Maybe it only feels like different worlds because I was young. But this movie starts in 2002 and ends in 2013. And to me, those years are basically the same. The idea that you get some instant nostalgia because the song at the beginning of the movie and the song at the end feel like they're from different eras, that totally didn't work for me because I didn't know any of the songs and they all sounded the same to me. But you're a millennial, so how about you?
I was quite detached from pop culture in my younger years. I did not listen to popular radio. Like all of that was kind of not a big part of my life. So I really didn't recognize the songs until Soulja Boy, which happens when he's like 10 years old. He's like, I don't know, maybe he's older than that. Maybe he's like 12. And that hit me. I had a moment that was like, whoa, that's weird. Like, that was like the soundtrack to my first year of college, and he's only a kid. Like, I was just, had that moment of like, that's a weird song for a 12-year-old to know. But I can't really comment on like whether sort of culturally they feel like such different moments, because I was just so not plugged into the culture, and things that happened when I was, I would say, like 6 to 14 might as well have been oldies to me for how much they impacted my life. I did pull up a list of the songs in it, but I really don't recognize most of these, at least by name, and I didn't recognize a ton of the music in the movie, or like movies. Let's see, what were the pegging events? Like they talk about like the Iraq War because Ethan Hawke gets all head up about it. They're canvassing for Barack Obama's first campaign in 2008. I don't remember other like items in the news in the movie. Do you?
Yeah, I guess those are the big two that we see. And it's another example of how it's different from Mad Men, where we have the obligatory checklist. Have we done the Nixon-Kennedy debate? Have we done the Kennedy assassination? Have we done the Martin Luther King assassination? Have we done the moon landing? That sort of thing.
Right. Also, not only because of like the particular interest of that show in like what is the 60s, but also they're adults, and they're involved with the events of the day. And like Mason is not, like he's a kid. He's just like, do. Like, I thought it was quite realistic. Like current events are coming into his life occasionally, but they're not really what he's thinking about. They're just like kind of the background to what he's up to until I think his dad makes him go canvassing. But even then it's like, he's there, he's into it, but he's kind of coasting along. But I think, is it a different era? I'm like, okay, between 2002 to 2013, you have the internet is a baby to like, holy shit, the internet is everything that we do. The internet is the worst. The internet is killing us. The internet is destroying our democracy. We all spend all of our life staring into our smartphones, except Adam, who doesn't have one. Like, all of that. So it's like, I think it's hard to argue there's not a change happening in the culture, but I don't have a strong like personal reaction to that question. I feel like 2002 and 2013 are pretty different because I experienced them very differently. I don't know if I have too much to say about it.
Well, moving on to another topic, whether or not the status quo of the world was particularly volatile over the course of this movie, I think the status quo of the movie itself was pretty volatile. Most narrative forms tend to start in medias res nowadays, I think, but movies in particular tend not to say outright, hello, viewer, here's this character, here's that character. You just get plunked down in the middle of things and you have to watch stuff unfold. And from listening to conversations and getting hints here and there, you're like, okay, so I guess that must be his older sister, and it looks like that's his mom. And you sort of put together the pieces, and then after the first 10 minutes of the movie, it's like, okay, I understand who all these people are, I understand what their relationships are, I understand the status quo. Let's go ahead and now see the movie. But in this movie, there are 11 big time jumps, so every few minutes, there's a whole new status quo, and again, it's not introduced. You get to a new scene, and you're like, oh, hey, they're married now, or wait, since when does he have a job? Or that sort of thing. So what did you think? Did that make the movie more interesting, or more frustrating, or both, or neither?
I didn't consciously notice it until you pointed it out, but that is a very interesting element of this movie. And I liked it. I found it really fun to try to kind of figure out what was happening with him now. And I would say the only moment when I was really struggled with it a little bit was when she breaks up with stepfather number 2, and she's talking about needing to downsize because it's like making the payments on a single income type of thing. And it took me a minute to be like, oh yeah, I haven't seen him. I guess he's not around anymore. Huh. Maybe the first time I watched it, there was a jump between like this annoying professor guy is flirting with her and then like, oh, they're married. Dear God, what a delight. But I didn't really notice it happening. It felt kind of natural. It didn't feel like sort of a hunting puzzle.
Exactly. Like you just said, the movie seems to make a point of skipping over the actual landmarks. We don't see any weddings. We don't see any divorce papers getting signed. We don't see the first kiss. We don't see the losing of the virginity. In 1 year, he hasn't been on a date before, and the next year, like, he's in bed with his girlfriend and it's nothing special. And so the precipitating event is elided.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's part of what makes it feel so smooth. Like, I think when I was describing it at the beginning, I was like, it does feel like a smooth arc with just like a few little jagged bits that poke out and really were like, wow, that was a moment. But mostly it's not. And I think that's very Linklater-y. The before movies are kind of about important turning points in these people's romantic lives, but it's basically all about how people talk to each other and how people express themselves. And it strikes me as kind of not surprising from him somehow.
Yeah, and some of it may also have to do with the principle in filmmaking that you start a scene as late as possible and you get out as early as possible. Mystery Science Theater used to make fun of this all the time, because old B movies would show a car pulling into a driveway and the people getting out and walking into a house, when you could just cut to them in the house and no one would be wondering, oh my god, how did they get there? Did they teleport? So in Boyhood, yeah, you get the first possibly flirtatious comment, and then bam, in the next scene they're already married. Because it's the flirtatious comment that signals the change. The wedding just ratifies it.
I was wondering as I was watching the movie whether we were watching sort of the moments from Mason's childhood that he would remember, with the idea that, our strongest memories sometimes are not those like big moments. I had a first kiss, but I don't really remember it that closely. I remember other romantic interactions from high school much more. They just were different. I don't know. And sometimes it's not obvious why. They're just there. They just struck me in some way. It's like a sense memory or a particular memory of something that happened that had more of an impact on me. And, I can easily believe that Mason would not have cared that much about what happened in those weddings. It's like, yeah, they're happening. Okay. It's the moment when he realized like something's happening with my mom and this guy. Like that's the moment of like, like I'm sure about this. And then like, well, it happened. Something about that feels kind of right to me. If the movie was about them, maybe not. But the movie's, as I assert, it's mostly about Mason.
I know what you mean about how your memory preserves stuff that doesn't seem like it should be very far up in the hierarchy of life moments. Like, if you were to ask me, what is your clearest memory from junior high school? It's the stupidest thing in the world. I have this very vivid memory of PE is over. I'm walking up the grass hill to go to the locker room. I reach the blacktop. I look down at the blacktop, and there is an interesting piece of broken glass on the blacktop. That's my number one memory from junior high is, oh, that's an interesting piece of broken glass. So, yeah, it's weird what sticks. So that is an interesting point. The idea that it's a compendium of the things you actually remember as opposed to the things that theoretically you're supposed to be remembering.
I think the moment when I thought that for the first time was when his photography teacher is giving him a lecture in the darkroom. This is just like a weird moment. Like, this is just like a teacher being kind of extra and Mason being kind of like whatever about it. But if he, becomes a photographer, he's an artist, that could be an influential conversation. That random guy just sort of taking an interest in him enough to yell at him for not working harder. I don't know. Maybe not. I guess maybe that's me sort of imposing another kind of movie on this one. The idea that that's a turning point and that's why we see it is because he becomes a photographer, but we don't actually know if that's what happens. So
that actually reminds me of something I was going to say and then forgot, so thanks for reminding me. We were talking at the beginning about how Before Sunrise leaves it an open question what's going to happen between these two characters, and then Before Sunset seems like it says, yay, they do live happily ever after.
Right.
But then along comes Before Midnight,
right.
And their marriage is falling apart, and it's like, wait, when you think about it, there is no ever after. So long as they're still alive, things are just going to keep on going. So with the question of Mason's future in Boyhood, when the movie ends, it's an open question. Maybe he'll be a photographer, or maybe he won't. Or maybe, if we check back in after 9 years, he would be a photographer, and then if we checked in 9 years after that, then whoops, he's working in an Amazon warehouse or something because the economy collapsed again.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, speaking of endings, I guess we're getting to the end of our time, so any concluding thoughts?
I was coming to this with the experience of having seen this movie twice before, and as I said, like, I am a giant Linklater fan. I haven't seen all his movies, but the before movies were my favorite movies, and I still really, really think they're great. And I even like Slacker, which a lot of people find just so intolerable, just like very tedious to watch. I only own 6 movies, and 3 of them are Linklater movies. So there's like, I'm a fan. And so when I went to watch this the first time, the premise sounded great, and I was expecting to love it, and I totally loved it. It was amazing. I was so enveloped by this narrative of a perfectly normal person growing up in this very well rendered moment in time, and the very naturalistic conversation, and like all of it worked for me. I was just like, yes, amazing. And then when it came out on streaming or whatever, I did my thing and I showed it to my girlfriend at the time, and I was like, this movie is so great, we have to watch it. I think I'd already tortured her through the before movies, which she did not really like, but I still made her watch this one. And so she didn't really like it. And so that always affects my experience of a movie. If the person I'm watching doesn't like it, I'm always kind of cowering. I'm like, oh, you're right, it's bad. And the second time I didn't like it as much. When you put something up on that high of a pedestal, when you watch it again, it's, often not going to quite be up on that level. So that was both sort of within 6 months of each other. And then 4 years later, I rewatched it a week ago. And I think it was kind of a reversion to the mean. Like, it was somewhere in the middle in terms of how much I liked it. But I was very curious how I would feel returning to it after that time. And I think basically I was back to number one. I completely loved it. I thought it was amazing. Except the end. Almost like the last third. I was just like, oh my God, like it's the same problem as Before Sunrise. It's like the teenagers just won't stop with their tedious conversation. I was just like, it was a little more than halfway through. I was like, oh my God, he's already like 14 years old. Are we really going to have to do this for another hour and a half? I just like couldn't. I had to take a pause. And I made it through. But I remember rolling my eyes at the same stuff this time around than I did before. And it was all like Mason talking to his high school girlfriend, and just like him being kind of tiresome about his philosophical ruminations, and her being kind of tired of it. I kind of felt like the same way that I was tired of it. And, it was well drawn. Like, I thought it was well drawn. And like when they break up, I kind of liked that scene. And, the idea that she like goes to date someone who's not as just like impossibly unsatisfied and artistic and just like mopey or something. I was like, yeah, that feels right. Like, she wasn't really into his whole thing. And like some people would be, like mystery girl at the beginning of freshman year is more into his random ruminations on life. And like, that's great. Maybe they'll have a beautiful before sunrise sunset story and end up, arguing about whether they cheated on each other in middle age. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, my standard line where teenagers are concerned is that the big problem ages are 13 and 19, the transition into adolescence and the transition out of it. That's when people turn into train wrecks. 16 is fine. At 16, they're used to being teenagers. They know their role. That's why I'm more interested in teaching high school than in teaching middle school or teaching college. And where this movie is concerned, like, college freshman Mason auditioning for a role in Waking Life is not someone I wanted to spend time with. So I'm glad the movie ended when it did.
I think the other big thing I got out of this movie that made me like it so much is that I generally struggle with kids. I like kids in theory, and from a distance, I think they're fascinating and charming and cute and interesting and just really cool, but I don't really know how to talk to them. And I think even as a kid, the way I talked was quite adultish. And so I think kids are not an area that I feel super comfortable with. And I do feel very comfortable with most people. So it's like kind of striking. And then I guess I shouldn't say most people, because I also struggle with straight men to a degree. Not everyone. It's not like I hate men, right? Like, I just only like the good ones. And like, I have less patience with a lot of sort of typically male traits. I'm very into feelings. I'm very into like vulnerability and like sharing that. Yeah, those are the big things, I think. I think there's probably more, but I'm not really into just like making jokes with people forever as a way to have a conversation. Like I actually want the conversation to be about something. And I think this is less true now that I'm an adult, but especially as a teenager, I was just like, what is the point of the way that you do things? I just like couldn't get it. I like dated men and it was fine, but and like the way that men open up to women when they're dating them is fine. It's a whole different thing. Or when they're trying to date them. But when men are like just trying to be your friend, like as a whole, obviously, I think you're very different from this prototype, and so are lots of other men. There's just like a thing. There's like something I don't love about the general American masculinity in the 21st century thing that's happening. And so something I got out of this movie is spending time with kids and a kid who is a boy who's growing into a man. And it was just so sympathetic in a way that enabled me to access the interiority of a boy child. And that was really cool because that's something that I struggle with. Like, that's why I struggle with kids is like, I don't really get what's going on in their heads. I don't understand how to translate what they're saying and doing to like what they're thinking or feeling. It's just like I can't read it very well. And I struggle sometimes in the same way with like a very sort of like typical straight man bro type. I'm like, what do you mean when you say that? Like, I just like can't parse it. Especially when it's, what feeling are you having right now? I feel very unmoored when I can't identify what's happening with someone's emotional life. And this movie just solved those problems for me. It was all, you just zero in on just watching this kid and like think sort of looking at some of the things around him that are influencing what's happening to him and how he's feeling and what he's thinking about. You see what he's looking at. We spend a lot of time just watching him look at things. We watch his behavior very closely. And it just felt like a very safe way for me to interact with these two categories of people that don't always make me feel at ease. And so I really liked that. Almost the most interesting thing for me to do, which is why I am thinking about becoming a therapist, is trying to think about like, what is this person thinking about right now? What are they feeling? Like, what does this mean? Like, I just really enjoy that exercise. And so this movie is almost nothing but that exercise, and so that's why I loved it.
And that wraps up our 5.5-year quest to talk about the movie Boyhood. Thanks for listening, and of course thanks also to the makers of Boyhood and to my guest, Katie Harrison. I don't know when the next installment of Radio K will be headed your way, but look for it on my site, on YouTube, on the Internet Archive, and on the galaxy-spanning telepathic uplink that I'm sure will have been invented by then. Bye for now.